the West Cork History Festival, living near Bantry, working for Mary I in Limerick. And I'm going to chair this panel discussion. I'm going to say very little. And really, this is a chance for you to ask questions and for our panel to pick up on those questions. We've had one question submitted online, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But really, it's over to you. So please, if you might just give us your name as well, and give us just a moment for a microphone to make its way to you. Thank you.
Patrick Coleman is the name. Just curious, in modern famines, the situation appears to be that men tend to flee the situation and the famine is left to the women and children to cope with. Is there any such evidence of that in the Irish famine?
Yours truly will take that. Yep, there's considerable evidence of that. Can you hear me without the microphone? Or do I need the microphone? We need the microphone. Yeah, there's considerable evidence of that, the abandonment of women, the abandonment of children. If you go and look through, say, the surviving records of workhouses, one is immediately struck by it. The number of women who have been abandoned, the number of orphans, or not orphans, but children abandoned by both parents. And in that material from the Skibbereen doctor, you know, where he talks of the woman coming in and saying she wished her children were dead. The other woman who tried to sell her child. So yes, you know, it's an extreme situation, and the bonds of consanguinity, the bonds of marriage, all those things fall apart. Like, human beings are not simply receptacles of food, fortunately. You know, we have culture, we have politics, we have likes and dislikes and so forth. And in a famine, all those things come into play. So you can imagine a relationship in which there is financial strain, and certainly relationships fall apart.
Okay. I mean, it's also the reason why Peel's policies stopped working towards the end of 1846, because the number of traditional nuclear families were falling, in that you had a lot of women heading households, abandoned children, and a public works scheme did not cater for them. So that influenced the U-turn in early 47 as well, although it had catastrophic effects, as I was saying.
I think in the literature you often see women who don't have their men with them for other reasons. So because they're rebels and they've had to flee, or because they've emigrated because they're trying to get money to send back to the family that way. But you do also, because I think it's very frequently the case that in famine novels you'll get a scene in a cabin with an abandoned woman and children, and you'll see them starving to death. There's a really fascinating one in Anthony Trollope where, in fact, the man isn't absent. He is working on the public works. He simply can't earn enough to feed his wife and children as well.
Thanks so much for that question. I hope there were some good reflections there on it. And
Don Wood. This is one for Charles. There were a number of studies done by the British government before the famine, which all looked at poverty in Ireland, and they all pointed towards a coming catastrophe with such a large percentage of the population dependent on one crop. Were there ever any plans actually to prevent it?
Well, there are plans to prevent it. So there's the Devon. There is the Devon Commission. I think the work of Peter Gray is the person who has looked at this, and the Devon Commission basically only reported just before the start of the fact. There wasn't enough time to implement it.
But there were a number of other studies, I think, of poverty in Ireland before that.
There were a number of studies, but the Peel government was, but the Peel government did focus more on political conciliation. So trying to, because its prime target was keeping Ireland in the Union and reducing popular support for Peel Association. So its conciliation measures tended to be more religious. Peel was thinking about Ireland more in religious terms, and appointing Catholics to senior administrative and legal offices, tripling the Maynooth grant in 1845. He was more thinking of conciliation religious than economic. So he prioritised political and religious measures over economic measures. Potentially that's, more could have been done, and more could have been done though.
And I suppose when one looks into the British parliamentary papers for this time, the state of Ireland is a very common phrase, isn't it? In all of these investigations, reports into what's happening, going back to the very beginning of the 19th century, the beginning of the time of the Act of Union, poverty alleviation, assisted immigration, partial famines, you name it. I mean, it's not that things were perfectly normal up until the time when everything just collapsed. I think that's been very widely documented by historians. Breandán, do you want to add anything to that?
No, you could add that the Great Poor Inquiry of the 1830s, that had issued in the establishment of a workhouse system. That there were proposals for the further reclamation of land and whatnot. So there was the development of a welfare system, but the recognition of the possibility of a famine and serious contemplation of that. I don't think that had really, correct me if I'm wrong.
There were Peel's policies, sort of government imports of food and public works, had been developed when he was Chief Secretary of Ireland. So he had been thinking about this since the 1810s. And they were the policies which they got out their drawer whenever famine happened. But it was a reactive policy. It wasn't it was reactive. It wasn't proactive. And basically, the scale of the need in 46 broke the system. It wasn't suitable.
The potato up until 1845 was essentially disease-free. Like, the great threat to the potato is frost. The notion that you could have the destruction of a crop by disease, or partial destruction of a crop by disease one year, and then this strange disease that nobody understood to come again in successive years, that was beyond the ken of people, really. Nobody had experienced anything like that before. There have been small regional famines caused by extremes of weather in the 1830s and so on. But the notion of something on this scale recurring, no, I don't think that, in my recollection, I don't think that was something that occupied people.
Did I see a hand up from Finola?
Is it on? Hi, I'm Finola Finlay. Don't you love it when people stand up and ask you questions about something you didn't say? But one of the things that struck me, especially listening to Breandán's harrowing, accounts of the suffering, is that anybody who worked tirelessly and unselfishly to relieve that suffering should really be a saint, be considered a saint. And one of the people who did that here was the Reverend William Fisher in Toormore. And in fact, far from being sanctified, he has gone down as the worst example of superism, without any actual concrete evidence that he was in fact exchanging souls for soup. And part of the evidence comes from the school's folklore collection, which you all have mined to great effect. And it struck me that the school's folklore is from the 1930s. It's very much dominated by a Catholic narrative and perspective. And I would love to see, at this point, that sectarianism really interrogated properly by one of you historians. So anybody like to take that on?
That's a very, you made a very interesting point, and I can produce another personal story in that where I grew up as a child, I went to a church whose first vicar was the Reverend William Pennefather. And William Pennefather was a habitual social entrepreneur, and his first job was he was Anglo-Irish. His first job as a clergyman was in Ireland, and he was also accused of superism to the point where he emigrated. This was probably less because he was doing superism, as in soup for conversion, but more because he had a mission school, which was education for conversion. But then that is the point of religious, charitable religious education. Churches still do it in that sense today. But he was accused. People locally accused him of superism, and he emigrated. And he founded all sorts of organisations, but the one which survived is the Mildmay Hospital in London, that he founded the first social workers for for women in the East End, that in the 80s focused on HIV/AIDS care, and for most of the last 30 years, the only specialist HIV/AIDS hospital care was provided by this charity. So. Ireland probably lost quite a few social entrepreneurs. So these are people who habitually found charities, who get the money together and things like that, to emigration because of some of these accusations. Some of them were probably true, but some of them probably were exaggerated or embellished significantly. And again, that damages Ireland's social capital and human capital in the long term. If these people are being lost. It wasn't simply financial capital people were taking with them, it was human capital. Capital.
If I could just say something on that comes at it in a perhaps vaguely perverse way, that there was a survey done in the 1830s on religious practice in Ireland, in which a survey was sent around all Catholic priests by the state, asking them how many hearers that they had at Sunday Mass. And attendance at Sunday Mass is a canonical requirement upon Roman Catholics. If you don't go to Sunday Mass, you're going to hell. Okay, that's the deal. I was born in 1969. In the early 1970s, survey was done. In excess of 90%, I think it was 92 or 93% of Irish Roman Catholics turned up for Sunday Mass. In other words, the only ones that didn't were the certifiably insane and those in institutions. But back in the 1830s, it was a figure for the country as a whole of something like 30%. Okay, something like 30%. And that's about the figure that you'd get for Austrian Catholics, for French Catholics, for German Catholics, for Spanish Catholics. I think the Austrians are high, if I remember correctly. But high mass attendance by Irish Catholics is a very modern phenomenon. The only areas where there was high mass attendance by Catholics, approaching anywhere near the 1970s level, before the famine, would have been places like the southeast, like Wexford, some of the major cities, Catholics of Belfast, Catholics of Dublin, probably some of the Catholics of Cork, they'd have had high levels. But in the more traditional parts of the country, like out here in West Cork, in the west of Ireland generally, you had very, very low levels. So people weren't a chapel-oriented people. Clerically directed devotions, including Sunday Mass, were not important to them. So when we talk about proselytism, and there was proselytism by evangelical Protestants, but like the Catholic Church was a net winner out of the famine, in that the people who died during the famine were disproportionately the people who didn't go to Mass, among the Catholics. So you had the highest levels of mortality among the people of Mayo, who wouldn't have known Sunday Mass if it came and bit them. And it wasn't because by the 1840s of any lack of chapels or any lack of priests. They just weren't into this. Okay, there were all the chapels there by the 1840s. They've been there for quite some time. There are plenty of priests. It's just people weren't into it. And we get them by the end of the century, at the end of the 19th century, figures that reached the levels, it's estimated, that they were still showing in the 1970s. So the Catholic Church, as the population fell, it was increasing its plant and personnel, increasing its plant and personnel. So the ratio of priests to people improved through the 19th century. the ratio of nuns to people improved through the 19th century. Once upon a time, I was able to recite off all the figures, but I'm tired. So when we say that was there Protestant, yes, there was proselytism by evangelical Protestants. That's what they do. That's why they're evangelical Protestants. But we can't lose sight of the fact that the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland, got a grip on people. And that wasn't completely independent of the state, because the state had cut a deal with the churches in the 1840s, with the churches, where when the national school system was established, that rolled out really in the 1840s, but it was established in 1831, that Catholic priests could become managers of schools. So invariably, in a little parish, you'd have a de facto Catholic school with the Catholic priest as manager, maybe a de facto Church of Ireland school or a de facto Presbyterian school or whatever. And that gave immense power to the Catholic Church, that they picked who the teacher would be. They were responsible for the operation of those schools. And before the famine, not only did people not go to Mass, but they didn't take any great interest in many of the devotions, the sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church that are massively important to it. So confession and communion didn't matter to people. They cared that their children were baptized, that people got married, and that the dead received the last rites. Okay, these were the biggies. And so rites of passage mattered to people. Confirmation, communion, no. And what we get then in the 1850s is that real hardcore, serious proselytizers hit the country in the form of the Redemptorists.
And the Vincentians.
Yeah, well, the Redemptorists in particular, like these are the stormtroopers of Roman Catholicism. Do you reject Satan and all his works?
Yeah.
You know, there's that anecdote of the fella in, I think it was West Donegal, like the Redemptorists roaring from the altar. Do you reject Satan and his work? I do. Do you reject Satan and his work? Louder. I do. And eventually some old fella at the back of the chapel gets really uptight. He says, oh, fuck the bastard. But what they did in the 1850s, what the Redemptorists did, is they made rites of passage of communion and confession and confirmation. Like, they are the great rites of passage into my lifetime for Roman Catholic children. Confession, communion, confirmation. And that was achieved in the aftermath of the Great Famine. And it's not due to any trauma, it's not due to any guilt. It's the people who disproportionately died were the least interested. Their religion was a religion of holy wells and seasonal festivals and prayers, etc. The priest was important for a couple of things: baptism, marriage, death. And that all started to change rapidly in the 1850s. So, yes, there was proselytism by evangelical Protestants, because that's what evangelical Protestants do. But let us not lose sight as there was another form of proselytism that completed a devotional revolution. Okay.
Breandán, thanks so much. Just before I hand over to this side of the panel, just to say thanks to Barry Cusack online for his question about religious observation pre- and post-famine, which Breandán has just answered without me even having to ask him. And just to say too, in terms of local history here in West Cork, some here may well know that there were two churches in the Catholic parish of Cork that were built by a very enthusiastic, classic kind of church building priest. Go out, get money, build a church. It's very common of the 1820s. He built two churches, one in Cork, one in Dromore. And in both cases, he had to actually put a curse on the local community, which was, if you keep demolishing the walls at night time of this church, you're going to hell. And that is, I think, a shock to many people to hear that, because they think of church building and the Irish Catholic Church as the post-famine Irish Catholic Church or the 20th century Roman Catholic Church, and not one where people would resent chipping in money or being forced to chip in money to build a church which they didn't necessarily want and weren't necessarily using. That's just the one local angle on it. It's a very big, interesting question that Finola has brought up, and a great response from Breandán and from Charles. On this side of the panel, Melissa, would you like to?
Yeah, I was just thinking there's a really excellent scene in O'Flaherty's Famine, exactly dealing with that, because a woman takes her 2 children to the very good Protestant clergyman and offers them to the clergyman in return for food, and then he gets a reputation for being a super. And I think it's an interesting scene in a novel where the Quakers, who have such an excellent reputation in famine relief, get fairly short shrift, because when they come to visit the Kilmartins, they think they're representatives from the government, or else they've come from the agent. And the central character, Mary, says that the tyrants have to be against the people have to be against the tyrants. So it's interesting that the Protestant clergyman is actually highly praised in that novel.
No, I've got no more to say on that.
You're getting off light so far.
I'm a visual artist, you guys are historians. I've got professors to a doctor or professors.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
I'm just thinking there's a novel by Evelyn Conlon called Not the Same Sky, which is about the famine orphans that are sent out to Australia. And one of the characters is a 21st century sculptor who's been commissioned to make a piece in Australia to respond to this. And she gets quite conflicted about it because she can't really work out what it's meant to do. And she's asking herself, is it meant to make us angry? Is it meant to make us weep? Is it meant to make us feel guilty? And I'm just wondering what you were intending with your sculptures.
Well, they're not sculptures as such. It's a site-specific artwork that relies on so many contemporary, so you have text in contemporary art, you have installation, you have found objects going back to the Dada movement. And it's a hard question to ask, because often my work always begins with some sort of little bit of text that intrigues me, and then it just evolves just through a lot of time in the studio or drawing or painting or making sculpture. And often the meanings don't really come to the end. Mm. And so those commissions are really, really awkward, because when you get a commission, and I've very rarely accepted commissions, but there's something imposed upon you as to what you should be doing. And as an artist, you should be free of all that. So if someone wants to commission me something that I want to do, I'd be happy to do it. But if it's got some either political or some other ulterior motive, no. So that artist is put in a difficult position.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. More questions? Simon.
Sorry, this is gross abuse of everybody's tolerance of one voice, but Melissa, I had a question for you. I was interested, as you surveyed the very extensive literature, the very extensive literary response to the famine, how often, if at all, have people sought to make comparisons between different experiences of famine? That is to say, Ireland alongside, the Taoiseach referenced the Holodomor in Ukraine. I mean, how often is the variety of experience of famine and people's response to it a subject of literary reflection by the people you've studied?
Yeah, Charles and I were talking about this last night, actually, because I would love to find some literature from the Ethiopian famine, for instance, that I could use to compare with the Irish literature or the Ukrainian Holodomor. And I think it's fascinating that there have been a lot of historical studies recently comparing, in particular, the Holodomor and the famine in Ireland, and yet there aren't really those literary comparisons. And I think it's partly to do with the lack of access to translations of Ukrainian works about the famine, or literary works about the famine, or Ethiopian. And I am desperate to find some. So if anybody does come across any, please do let me know. I was talking to somebody a bit earlier who was talking about comparison with other famines in Ireland. And there I think there are quite a lot. So you get a lot of... just thinking about Carleton's The Black Prophet, the fact that it isn't actually about the 1845 to 51 famine, it's about 1822. Or Patrick Bronte wrote a book called The Maid of Killarney, which is about the 1817 famine. So I think you do get those, and you get others from the 1880s. So the scarcity in the 1880s. I found quite a lot of those miscatalogued as being about the Great Famine, because the kind of motifs and the kind of imagery that's being used is absolutely the same as what emerges from the Great Famine.
Thanks very much. Do we have? Yes, please.
May I make two observations? I'm Brian Walker. The first is this: the Reverend Trail was rector here in Skibbereen in 1847, Skull, and the Illustrated London News come to Skull, and he's portrayed in one of their illustrations. And the illustrations we saw on the screen, I think, are to do with Skull and they're to do with the Reverend Trail. The second point is this: the remarks being made that women and children were commonly found in the poorhouse. Men weren't there. There was a reason for that. And the reason for that was, according to the quarter-acre clause of the Gregory Clause, if you were a tenant of more than a quarter of an acre, you wouldn't qualify. But the problem was, well, the question was, what happens if a woman and children turn up without the husband? Surely they're not occupiers. So this went to the highest law opinion in the country. And in late 1847, it was decided that was okay. They were entitled to aid. If they were no longer tenants that their husband was, they weren't anymore, so they were entitled to aid. So that's why you probably ended up with more women and children.
Yeah, Brian. But if you go through the poorhouse registers, it says abandoned, abandoned, abandoned. You know, it is noted that the children, the wives, etc., had been abandoned, gone to America, husband in America, husband has gone to Scotland.
Yeah. But what it couldn't say was he was the tenant of a 3-acre farm, although that might have seemed to disadvantage them. But
yeah, okay.
I mean, they could have gone to. I mean, they could have. Some of them did. There was a trend of people doing seasonal work in Britain on off agricultural seasons. So it could be that some of them went to Britain to find work and weren't going to come back. Yeah. For several years as well, rather than completely abandoned with the intention of being picked up in a few years' time.
You both have a very, very high opinion of the Irish male. I know a lot of Irish males. And,
oh yes, I'd be of course both.
I think in extreme economic circumstances, relationships come under pressure. Relationships break down. Some fellas leave, and that's a fact. And that happened in the Irish famine, and it's widely attested to.
And working class divorce was a thing. I think the mayor of Casterbridge, the first scene is of the sailor selling his wife, and as long as the wife gave her permission, this was legally permitted. Maybe more informally than formally, but it did happen. It's sort of. Our view of marriage is very formed by a middle-class 19th century view of it rather than what the working classes actually did earlier in the 19th century.
Melissa, did you want to come back on the
no,
general
I'm just
point?
wondering, I'll have to defer to the historians, of course, but I'm just, haven't there been, or weren't there cases of people who were arrested as they tried to emigrate because they'd left children or they'd left dependents back in the workhouse? I'm thinking of Cian McMahon's recent book on the coffin ship, where he comes up with a couple of cases of that. So I think it is possible that some of those who went to the workhouse and listed themselves as having been abandoned.
Yeah, like if somebody goes into Duckett's apothecary shop in Kenmare and tries to sell their child, a woman, I think we can stretch. And knowing that the child would be dissected, or to use another phrase that the fella used, I'll make it into syrup. Like, if we can document this happening, and we have loads of records document the abandonment of women and children, I don't see why there's a difficulty accepting that the Irish male can be, you know, not the highest specimen of the species on all occasion.
I suppose, you know, what we're coming back to again and again here is the collapse of normal society and what that meant in every house, in every farm, and every street in the country. And I think that's really come out this afternoon in so many different interesting ways, and how we reflect on that total collapse as it happened here over several years.
Yeah, and I agree.
That's great. you never know, Breandán, if he's going.
He's reluctant to agree, but he agrees.
There was a hand that would a few hands. Gemma?
I'm Gemma Clark. Thank you very much for all the excellent papers. I just wondered about the impact of, or the relevance of, anniversaries on all of your work. So we've got 175 years currently. Asking this partly selfishly because myself and some others are, you know, what we're talking about tomorrow is a centenary, and that's put our area of research in the limelight. So I just wondered how you all think about that in terms of how do you think it might change, you know, in the next 25 years and when it's 200 years? Are there going to be new ways of looking at it coming through, or do you think the number doesn't matter so much once you get beyond? I know, Melissa, in your talk, you talked about how different focuses came out, you know, in the 90s and the different anniversaries. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on how that 175 is affecting what you do, and maybe how that might change going forward. Thank you.
I know 150 had a very big personal relevance for me, because it was around that time that I was trying to decide what I would do my PhD thesis on. And initially I'd thought I might do Joyce, and my supervisor said, forget it, because pretty much all of the dissertations coming out of America at that time were on Joyce. And I'd just read Macken's The Silent People and started thinking about that. And then the coincidence of the 150th anniversary just steered me in that direction. So I think it's been very, very important for me.
Yeah, and I think in three of your presentations today, you've referenced historiography in different ways, and how this area has developed over the last few decades. I was thinking in particular, Breandán, do you want to go next on that in terms of what comes next?
I'm not sure that centenaries always and anniversaries always produce good history. I think with centenaries, the sesquicentenary of the Great Famine in the mid-90s, that lots of communities tried to hang their history on the famine. Everybody wanted to have the famine in their community in a certain way. And not every place was the famine as significant as it was elsewhere, you know. So some places were shoehorned into it in ways that centenaries are good in that they release funding. You know, the gentleman who could release funding is gone, so this is redundant. But they don't always produce great history. And, you know, history, as the man who's departed said, you know, is grey. It's not black and white. And with public commemoration, there's a tendency to get black and white. So what was good, I suppose, about the sesquicentenary of the famine was the big issue about the numbers had been more or less sorted. Kind of heroic phase of scholarship in the 80s, Mokeer, O'Grada and co. And the issues of what was done to and for the poor by landlords, charities, the state remained important. But it was starting to look at what did poor people, you know, what did Irish Catholics, what did Irish Protestants, what did they do to and for each other? And, you know, that's a massively interesting area without making any comparisons between different disasters. I found, thinking about the famine, that Primo Levi's writing on Auschwitz was very suggestive of what people experienced in extremis during the famine. He says, when you entered Auschwitz, the first shock, the first real shock, was it wasn't people in SS uniforms who thumped you. It was your fellow prisoners dressed in the striped pajamas. And that was the real shock for Primo Levi. And when we look at the famine, we look at the mother selling her child, the poor stealing food from each other, rioting at soup kitchens. You start to see that society is breaking down, families are breaking down. And it doesn't always fit simple black and white narratives that tend to be the focus in major commemorations. That little anecdote we had earlier about the penny bun that Skibbereen man Jeremiah O'Donovan Russell lived with for the rest of his life. If you read Primo Levi on Auschwitz, he records how himself and another prisoner found water in a pipe that they were cleaning up part of the yard, and they surreptitiously drank it together and didn't share it with another workmate. They didn't let him know that they'd found it. It's the exact same story as the one O'Donovan Russell told, with water replacing bread. And Levy records that all three survived, but the other fella copped on that the two boys had found some water on a hot summer's day and didn't share it. And that never went away. And he lived with the shame of not having shared the water. So you can make those comparisons without going too far with your comparisons.
Charles, John, do you want to comment on that?
No, I don't, actually.
Charles?
I just have to remind you, I'm a visual artist. So I'm a historian. So.
Welcome all comments.
I can ask a question of the historians, though. Why do you keep referring it to as a famine when quite clearly there's food available? Why do you use that word?
I think it's still a famine in that it's not that Ireland is producing enough food to feed itself. It's just that it's being imported. It's still a famine in that there's a scarcity of there's still a scarcity.
In my presentation, I showed where there are 300 pigs with 1,100 people being sent across to Liverpool.
I am not an economist. He's an economist, but an economist could tell you. Any economist, Charles. I'm speaking with Charles. But a famine isn't a complete absence of food. You had Bob Geldof on there talking about the Ethiopian famine. Mm-hmm. Melissa's just referred to the Ethiopian famine. I remember the early 1980s when Bob Geldof had his Band-Aid, and you had the horrendous pictures coming out of the relief camps, but you had plenty of people living very high on the hog in Addis Ababa. So
weren't they in Europe though? There was an overabundance of wheat.
Yeah, but there was food in Ethiopia during the Ethiopian famine. It's just some people weren't able to reach that food.
So is it a famine then?
Yeah, because a famine isn't a complete absence of food.
It's widespread lack of access to food.
Yeah, it's inability to get food.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Do you want to?
I prefer the word the Great Hunger.
Well, the great hunger.
I know I pronounced it badly.
Well, no, you pronounced it fine. But the Great Hunger is a term that, as far as I can see, the Great Hunger is derived from a radio program on BBC or RTÉ, I forget which, in the 1930s or 40s. It's not a term we can use any term we like, but people would have used all sorts of phrases to describe it in the folklore archive and common speech. People to refer to it as the bad times, an drohiel, the bad life, and I wouldn't get hung up on the word famine.
I'm not hung up on it.
No, I understand that. Yeah, but if one accepts that a famine isn't a complete absence of food, that there can be food in a society, but some people within the society do not have the power to get that food, or the organisation of that society won't distribute it to them, that's famine. Charles will answer this.
Oh, sorry. So I was going to say the first sort of semi-scholarly book written by John O'Rourke about the famine did have the term famine in it, and he was an eyewitness to I think he was a student at Maynooth, student priest at Maynooth. So the famine is a older descriptor than hunger, certainly in the English-speaking literature. But at the time, they called it all sorts of things, famine, crisis,
They also
scarcity.
call it the Great Famine, like Peter Foyn's book, they call it the Great Famine. But what was great about it?
It's bigger than all the other famines. They had famines constantly in the 19th century.
Well, they called it the Great War, but there was nothing great about it. It was just a big one. Why they call it the Big War?
It was for arms manufacturers.
Sorry?
It was for arms manufacturers.
I mean, but vocabulary does change its meaning over time. So great could just mean large rather than good or wonderful. I mean, it's rather like like John Milton used to say, God is awful. Meaning awful, you should be in full of awe, not as in terrible or horrible. Or appeasement, which went from appeasement is a good thing before 1938 because it shows you're being cooperative to being appeasement became a very negative. So words do change meaning over time.
Yeah, but it's a really important point, John, because I think any person working on the famine who's on social media has been told there was no famine, it was a genocide, there was food in the country. But I think if you think about the etymology of the word famine, it comes from hunger.
Famished.
Yeah, and the first famine novel is subtitled A Tale of Irish Famine. And it is still acknowledging there's food in the country, it's being exported, or the rich have access to it. It's the poor who are suffering.
The historian's 1943 in the Indian famine in Bengal. You aware of that?
So again, that's entitlements. That's entitlements famine. So the Indian economy overheated because of the amount of war effort spending. So manufacturing workers outbid the agricultural workers for the food, and the colonial officials didn't do enough to redistribute entitlement. So again, it's a lack of ability to purchase food rather than there wasn't food in India, because there were parts of India which did have food surpluses, but their officials refused to send it to further east.
The British?
Well, it was the top level with the British still, but they did have democratically elected, although on a limited franchise sub-level, and the bits which form modern Pakistan in particular didn't want to help.
You're a visual artist.
I'll back.
So
No.
and therefore, let's answer the question with something that's visual. One of the key forms of protest that you encounter in the early stages of the famine, when wages have fallen and people have been thrown out of work, is that there'll be marches in towns at which they get some scrawny fella and put him up at the front with a big long pole, and at the top of that pole they'd have a loaf of bread, and they go demonstrate at the courthouse or wherever the hoi polloi were gathered. And that's a way of showing that there's food here, but the food is out of reach of us. Okay? And that's what famine is. There's food there, but we can't get the food. Okay.
Very good visual.
Thanks so much. I think maybe next year a whole panel about terminology in Irish history, or a whole day maybe.
I'd like to see something about Nicholas Marshall Cummins, more history on him, because he's a fascinating man, but historians haven't really broached him as yet. And only just recently I've learned that he died in poverty, or was it confirmed he died in poverty in Paris after Anne Shaw kindly, is Anne Shaw still here? She's gone. Forwarded something to me that her nephew had sent to her. She had a record. She was at school with Clemens's niece, I think it was. And he died of poverty because the nephew recorded that he gave all his money away during the famine. On Baltimore, sorry. So he's, as Bob said, he was a very interesting man for that time, because he was maybe well ahead of his time, but very little has been written about him. And what he did was absolutely extraordinary. And as a visual artist, that's why I've etched his words in stone in the Tate Cathedral, as we call it, because a bit like Westminster Abbey, Poets' Corner, or churches you go into and you see things set in stone. And his words paint the picture that the artist couldn't. And you referred to illustrations, a lot of illustrations, but illustrations were never fine art. And in the 19th century, the picture of Dorian Gray is not called the portrait of Dorian Gray, it's the picture of Dorian Gray. There's a lovely saying, picture's worth 1,000 words.
Mm.
So, but I've kind of reversed it in our garden. Words paint the picture.
If we had one maybe final brief question, we're running out of time. Any final thoughts? Yes, please.
More on immigration after the famine, in particular the scenes from Liverpool. The numbers of Irish, there's a portrait of Irish America and the Irish contribution to America, but there's no portrait of the Irish contribution to British society. About 20 years ago, there was an opinion piece in the Guardian newspaper by a man called Edward Pearce, where he described the Labour Party. Now, I know they're a later creation, but he described the Labour Party in the north of England as the Fianna Fáil of the north. And I think that was the contribution that Irish made to the building of the Labour Party in the north of England when that time came around. The portrait we get is of the poor Irish going to America, but I would think that overwhelmingly the poor Irish actually went to England rather than to America.
I would observe that the Labour Party in the north of England and Fianna Fáil have suffered a similar fate of late.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I think Liam Kennedy has the historian at Queen's University Belfast. Liam Kennedy is working on that precise topic. So going through workhouse records and of what happened to the Irish when they got to England. And there are some demographic historians who say that working class England is more Irish than has previously been assumed because of emigration from the famine period. And some of the time, the identity got, compared with later waves, which kept more successful in keeping their identity, some of it got diluted because of regulations which said if you claimed poor relief in England, you could be sent back to your parish of origin. And indeed, you had poor law unions doing ping pong with people, with Irish paupers between Ireland and England. And it seems that it might be true that some of them on official documents, such as censuses, claim that they were born in England or Scotland rather than Ireland. I think it was discovered that poet who did the terrible. Oh no, the terrible poem about the Tay Bridge disaster. William McGonagall seems to be down in the census as being born in the wrong place, in spite of the fact there's evidence he was born.
You might look into that steamship history too.
I think the Scots are welcome to him.
So he's one example of somebody who's down on the census being born in the wrong place. It might be that some of them didn't want, adopted English or Scottishness as an attempt not to be deported by the poor law.
He's very proud of
Apologies to any McGonagall fans.
Charles, I just break in there. You might check up the steamship history because what I've read is that some of the landowners in Ireland, or a lot of them, would give money to the people. Get down to the Dublin docks or the Cork docks. There's your fare. Get to Liverpool. You get to Australia or America or thing. But like it said, when they got to Liverpool, if they got caught doing anything, or they either want to go to jail or get sent back to Ireland, the government would actually pay them to go back to Ireland. And because
the poor law unions, yes, because it was cheaper than.
But the steamship companies were making money both ways.
Okay. You could.
They were like going, great, we'll take you over there. They're paying, and then you get paid to take them back.
You could get from Ireland to England for free if you're willing to travel in a coal ship in the hold, because rather than you have to weigh a coal ship would take coal.
Oh, the ballast.
But you'd have to throw ballast in, and it was cheaper to have human.
I haven't read that one yet.
But this did lead to disasters because ballast holds are not designed for humans. And
well, the Londonderry tragedy was awful, and that like only a few weeks ago, that thing in just the coast of border of Mexico, where. Exactly the same thing happening.
You could still see this in the Philippines. I think the Philippines has a lot of ferry disasters of overloaded ferries taking migrants around. It's still happens in the developing world.
I think just the time is against us, and we may have to draw things to a close. Just before I hand back to Simon, just to say thanks so much to our four speakers, to Melissa, John, Charles, and Breandán for their contributions, and to you for being with us for a good long session today, and for the questions and the discussion. And with that, I'll hand back to